Welcome to today's deep dive. Just imagine, in the span of just a few generations, your ancestors went from working this quiet, predictable plot of land they'd lived on for centuries
To
to,
being violently displaced.
right, violently displaced into these soot-choked cities, and
Yeah.
suddenly they were working like 14-hour shifts. Their bodily movements are being timed by men with stopwatches.
And ultimately, they found themselves mass-producing machine guns and poison gas.
It's incredibly grim.
Mhm.
But today, we are diagnosing the profound trauma of the modern world. We're unpacking this really extensive, detailed set of historical lectures that try to map out these massive, earth-shattering transitions.
The shifts that dragged humanity out of the agrarian early modern period.
Exactly, and just threw us headfirst into the explosive, violent chaos of the 20th century revolutions. And, the causes and effects here are deeply entangled.
Oh, absolutely. They're psychological, they're economic, and they are deeply cultural.
So our mission today is to figure out what exactly modernity is. We're going to explore the rise of capitalism, the sheer force of industrialization, and a very specific, uniquely American brand of progress.
Because we want to understand how these sweeping forces didn't just build the comfortable, consumer-driven world you and I live in today, but how they triggered massive, violent pushback across the entire globe.
Right. We are setting out to answer one fundamental question. What exactly were people in the 20th century revolting against? Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand a revolution, we have to look backward at the status quo that was being destroyed.
That is really the only place to start. I mean, you cannot grasp the sheer psychological whiplash of modernity without grounding yourself in the world that existed before it.
The before picture.
Right. For centuries, going back to the 1500s and earlier, the overarching status quo for the vast majority of humanity was feudalism. This was a world that was overwhelmingly agricultural and intimately local. The entire social fabric was woven around these rigid, patriarchal, and patrimonial relationships.
Let me stop you right there, because patrimonial is a term that gets thrown around a lot in history classes, but I want to make sure we're completely clear on what it means in the lived experience of an everyday person back then. Are we just talking about inheritance, like passing down a farm?
No, it goes much deeper than just inheriting property. A patrimonial system is one where power flows directly from a single figure at the top.
Like a king.
Well, yes, but think of it like a father figure in a household just scaled up to a whole society. It's deeply personal. If you were a peasant in this era, your entire existence was tied to a specific plot of land, and that land was owned by a lord.
So you're essentially just paying rent.
Not just rent. You didn't just pay a fee.
Yeah.
You had this intricate web of personal obligations to that lord. You gave him a significant portion of your harvest. You provided manual labor for his personal estate.
And what do you get out of it?
Well, in exchange, he provided you with physical protection from bandits or rival armies, and crucially, a guaranteed permanent place in the world.
Okay, so it's a system built entirely on mutual obligation.
Exactly.
Obviously, it's not a fair or equitable obligation. I mean, the peasant is clearly at the bottom of the pyramid doing the back-breaking work.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is that it was intensely stable.
It was the bedrock of societal psychology. You knew exactly where you fit in the social hierarchy. Your father worked that land, you worked that land, and you knew with absolute certainty that your children and grandchildren would occupy that exact same spot.
Right.
It was rigid, it was stifling by modern standards, but it provided an incredibly robust psychological safety net. Nobody was going to suddenly fire you from being a peasant because the market had a bad quarter.
Yeah, that makes sense. But as we move into the early modern era, and specifically accelerating into the 18th and 19th centuries, that centuries-old safety net is just shredded.
Completely shredded.
The rise of capitalism and the commercialization of agriculture fundamentally rewrite the rules of human survival.
The transition is brutal. What happens is that the lords, the landowners, they begin to look at global markets. And they realize, wait a minute, I can make far more money if I stop letting these peasants grow cabbages on my land, and instead I enclose this vast acreage to raise sheep for the booming international wool trade.
But to do that, they have to get rid of the peasants?
Exactly. They have to remove the people who have lived there for countless generations.
Which brings us to the Enclosure Acts in England. And we shouldn't gloss over the mechanics of this. It wasn't just like a polite eviction notice.
No, not at all.
It was a structural severing of a human being's tie to the earth.
Yeah.
You are physically putting up fences and walls over common lands, legally stripping families of their ancestral homes just to run a more profitable agricultural enterprise.
The Enclosure Acts were a profound trauma. They represent a massive foundational shift in human history, the transition from feudal obligation to wage labor.
Which is huge.
Almost overnight, in the grand scheme of history, the relationship between human beings ceases to be based on mutual obligation and becomes purely transactional.
Wow.
You are no longer tied to a lord who has a reciprocal, albeit unequal, duty to let you survive on his land. Instead, you are thrust into a free market where your only asset is your physical labor, and you have to sell it for a wage.
It's wild to think about the sheer psychological terror of that moment. It honestly reminds me of the modern anxiety surrounding the gig economy, but like amplified by 1,000.
That's a really apt comparison.
Because on paper, the transition from serf to wage laborer sounds like liberation, right? You're a free agent. You can sell your labor to the highest bidder.
Right, the ultimate freedom.
But the dark flip side of that sudden freedom is the terrifying loss of any societal safety net. You are entirely on your own. If a factory owner or a commercial farmer needs you, they pay you a meager wage. But the very second they don't need you, maybe because of a minor recession, a bad harvest, or just because they want to cut costs, you are dismissed.
There is zero loyalty.
None. So what does this all mean for the everyday person trying to survive this overnight shift?
Yeah.
How do you just adapt to the fact that you might starve next week if the wool market dips?
Well, the reality is a huge portion of the population desperately tried not to adapt.
They fought back.
They resisted it with everything they had. Many displaced people tried to maintain traditional ways of living, perhaps by relying on informal charity, foraging, or migrating to avoid the brutal trap of wage labor in these new, terrifying factories. They recognized inherently how precarious the wage system was.
But the powers that be weren't just going to let a massive potential workforce wander around the countryside, right? They needed bodies in the factories.
Exactly. The state had to actively intervene to force the population into this new capitalist paradigm. In England, the government enacted a series of incredibly harsh legislations known as the Poor Laws.
And these laws essentially criminalize the very concept of unemployment and vagrancy.
Let's really emphasize that. It was literally legally a crime to be poor and out of work. If you were displaced by the Enclosure Acts and you couldn't find someone to buy your labor, you were a criminal.
That is just terrifying.
It is the stark reality. If the authorities found you wandering without a job or visible means of support, you wouldn't just be fined. The state would forcibly incarcerate you in a workhouse.
And these workhouses were intentionally designed to be nightmarish.
Oh, absolutely. The conditions were engineered to be worse than the lowest paying factory job, just to ensure that people would accept any wage, no matter how miserable, rather than end up in a workhouse. And once inside, you could be leased out by the state to work for manufacturers.
It's essentially a state-enforced pipeline feeding human fuel into the new capitalist machine.
Mm-hmm.
When we read Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, I think a lot of people today view the workhouse scene as just a dramatic, slightly exaggerated Victorian fiction.
It wasn't.
No, Dickens was functioning almost as an investigative journalist. Oliver being starved and leased out as an apprentice was a direct reflection of a brutal, deliberate system designed to crush any resistance to wage labor.
It was a mechanism of social control. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this wasn't just an economic shift. It was a profound psychological shock to humanity, ripping away centuries of community structure. And while the social fabric was being aggressively rewritten by these laws, the actual physical fabric of the earth was being completely terraformed by the Industrial Revolution.
It really was.
It is difficult for us living in the 21st century to comprehend the sheer sensory shock of this era. Accounts from the time describe the skies over industrial centers in Europe literally turning black from the relentless output of coal-fired smokestacks.
The physical transformation is just staggering. We go from a world powered by human muscle, animal labor, and the occasional water wheel to a civilization powered by controlled explosions and steam.
Right.
Humanity suddenly unlocks an unprecedented, almost godlike capacity for material production. We aren't just spinning a few textiles by hand in a cottage anymore. We have massive, deafening factories churning out miles of linen, cotton, and woolen textiles.
We are forging iron and steel at rates that would have seemed like pure magic just a century prior.
And crucially, the outputs of this industrialization feed back into the system to accelerate it even further, right?
The cheap iron and the mastery of steam power create the transportation revolution. This is where the world fundamentally shrinks.
We're talking about railroads and steamships.
But consider the mechanics of what that actually means. Before the steamship, global commerce was entirely at the mercy of the wind and the weather. If the winds weren't blowing, your cargo didn't move.
You're just stuck.
Exactly. Suddenly, you have iron-hulled ships driven by massive steam engines that can cut across the oceans with absolute predictability, completely ignoring the wind. Simultaneously, tens of thousands of miles of iron rail are being laid down, blasting through mountains and spanning rivers.
Which completely changes the math of human survival. Because suddenly you can transport massive, heavy, bulk commodities, things like grain, sugar, coffee, iron ore, and coal, across vast continental distances at incredibly low costs.
Right, you don't have to grow all your food locally anymore.
That transportation efficiency, combined with the new commercial agriculture, generates massive food surpluses. And this leads to an explosion in urbanization.
Historically, cities were limited in size by how much food could be grown in their immediate vicinity. In the 18th century, a city of 50,000 people was considered a massive, bustling metropolis.
But by the late 19th century, because you have all these displaced peasants looking for wage labor, and you have railroads bringing in endless tons of grain to feed them, you see cities absolutely ballooning.
You have urban centers swelling to 300,000, 400,000, even 500,000 people in a shockingly short time frame.
It is a demographic earthquake, and it is a profound paradox. On one hand, the sheer logistical power of this new network drastically reduces the likelihood of localized famines. If a crop fails in one region, the railroad can rush surplus grain from another.
The absolute baseline of human caloric intake stabilizes in many areas.
But the human cost of that efficiency is staggering. You have hundreds of thousands of displaced, deeply alienated people crammed into sprawling, unsanitary urban slums. They are utterly dependent on wage labor in unregulated, dangerous factories.
Centuries of localized community structure, of generational knowledge, of deep connection to the land wiped away in a few generations.
I think we need to pause and appreciate the volatility of what we've just described. You have built a massive, insatiable economic engine. And capitalism, once it gets going, is voracious. It cannot sit still.
No, it requires constant compounding growth.
It needs an endless stream of raw materials to feed the deafening factories, and equally important, it needs ever-expanding markets to buy all the manufactured goods those factories are pumping out. You can only sell so many woolen coats in Manchester.
Right.
Which naturally brings us to the next massive historical shift. When the borders of Europe became too tight, when the domestic markets were saturated and the local coal mines weren't enough, the great powers didn't slow down. They turned their eyes outward.
They had to. The internal logic of the system demanded it. This brings us into the era of the Great Scramble for the Globe, which was driven fundamentally by a profound crisis of competition.
Let's explore that, because the narrative we often get is just Europe decided to conquer the world. But it was actually a fierce internal panic among European nations that drove it, right?
Absolutely. Initially, through the first half of the 19th century, England was essentially the sole unquestioned industrial superpower. Because they had absolutely no real rivals, the British were massive champions of free trade.
Sure, because free trade benefits the winner.
Exactly. They wanted all borders open because they knew they could manufacture goods cheaper and better than anyone else. But as the 19th century progressed, the monopoly broke. Other nations aggressively industrialized, specifically Germany, France, Holland, and across the Atlantic, the United States.
And the nature of this new wave of industrialization was different. It wasn't just small textile mills anymore. We were looking at the birth of the modern, colossal corporation, particularly in science-based industries.
That's the crucial mechanism. Take the global chemical industry of the late 19th century. It wasn't comprised of thousands of small shops. It was essentially dominated by a tiny handful of massive cartels, primarily in England and Germany.
And these heavy industries required massive capital investment and specific raw materials that couldn't always be found in Europe. Things like rubber, specific nitrates for fertilizers and explosives, copper, and petroleum.
So you have these massive national champion monopolies locked in a fierce existential death match with each other. A German chemical cartel cannot afford to rely on British-controlled trade routes to get its raw materials.
And it can't afford to have its manufactured goods blocked by French tariffs.
Precisely. They needed guaranteed exclusive sources for their raw materials, and they needed captive markets where they could dump their surplus manufactured goods without being undercut by their rivals. So these corporate behemoths turned to their respective national governments.
They demanded state protection.
Yes, and state intervention to secure their economic futures.
And the government solution was imperialism, which is honestly the ultimate anti-free market move. If you use your military to physically conquer a territory in Africa or Asia, you can draw a border around it and guarantee that your domestic corporations get 100% of the resources and 100% of the customers within that border. You lock the competitors out.
The scale of this territorial seizure is almost impossible to truly wrap your head around. It wasn't a gradual expansion, it was a frantic, paranoid land grab.
It was incredibly fast.
In the space of just 50 years, in the late 19th century, England alone added roughly 4 million square miles and 60 million human beings to its imperial system.
Just writing those numbers down feels absurd. 4 million square miles in a few decades.
And they weren't alone. The European powers sat down at conference tables and literally drew lines on maps carving up almost the entirety of the African continent, with the rare exception of places like Ethiopia, which successfully fought them off. When the ancient Ottoman Empire began to collapse, the British and the French immediately moved in to partition the Middle East to secure trade routes and, eventually, oil. China, though technically remaining a sovereign state, had its major coastal cities and trade networks completely subordinated to European economic and military control.
And vast swaths of Southeast Asia fell under French and Dutch dominion. But here's the massive psychological problem with doing that. You cannot mobilize a nation, draft young men into an army, and subjugate half the planet by telling your voting public, we are doing this because the National Chemical Cartel needs a better profit margin on nitrates.
Right. The public wouldn't stand for it.
It sounds entirely too cynical. You have to dress it up. You have to sell the conquest to your own people as a moral imperative. And the historical record outlines three primary, deeply flawed, and incredibly toxic ideological frameworks that the West constructed to rationalize this unprecedented aggression.
Which we're analyzing impartially here, just reporting on the sources to understand their mindset.
Exactly. Let's look at the first one, scientific racism.
Yes. The 19th century was obsessed with categorization and the new sciences of biology. But they warped these disciplines to serve political ends. Scientific racism was the pseudoscientific attempt to categorize human beings into a rigid biological hierarchy.
Using literal pseudoscience.
Thinkers and so-called scientists produced volumes of literature arguing, without any genuine empirical basis, that certain races were inherently biologically superior in intellect and capability, while others were biologically stunted.
It's an incredibly convenient theory if you're trying to steal someone's land. By creating this false biological hierarchy, European powers could stand up and argue that it was their natural right, even the proper order of the universe, to exert control over supposedly inferior populations in Africa, Asia, and the Americas.
It provided a veneer of objective scientific justification for brutal subjugation. And that flows directly into the second major ideological framework, social Darwinism.
This one is fascinating because it takes Charles Darwin's revolutionary theories about biology and the evolution of finches on the Galapagos Islands and highly inappropriately copy-pastes them onto human political systems.
It is a gross misapplication of the concept of survival of the fittest. Social Darwinists essentially argued that human societies and nations are locked in an eternal, natural, and intense struggle for existence, just like animals in a jungle.
So they looked at their own technology and claimed it was proof of their fitness.
Exactly. They pointed to the fact that European nations had developed superior weaponry, steamships, and industrial capacity, and claimed this was empirical proof that Europeans were the fittest society.
Therefore, if a European army with Maxim machine guns mows down a local resistance force armed with spears, that isn't a horrific moral failing or a massacre. It's simply nature taking its course, its evolutionary progress.
Right. It framed imperial violence and conquest not as greed, but as a natural, inevitable, and ultimately progressive mechanism of human evolution. The weak give way to the strong.
But perhaps the third justification is the most insidious, because it appeals directly to morality.
This is the concept of the white man's burden, popularized by writers like Rudyard Kipling.
I push back on this one the most when reading the history, because the cognitive dissonance required to believe it is staggering. This is the idea that the imperial powers weren't acting out of economic self-interest or dominance, but out of a selfless, agonizing moral obligation.
It frames the entire imperial project as a grand, exhausting, civilizing mission. The prevailing narrative fed to the domestic public was that these colonized regions were deeply backward, lacking in true civilization, law, or spiritual salvation.
conveniently ignoring the reality on the ground.
It conveniently and deliberately ignored the fact that societies across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia possess deeply complex cultures, ancient legal codes, sophisticated trade networks, and civilizations that often predated Europe's by thousands of years.
They positioned themselves as the benevolent, long-suffering parents whose tragic duty was to uplift the rest of the infantile world. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. You are framing a violent territorial seizure, the extraction of millions of tons of resources, as a moral burden.
And while they were writing poetry about their civilizing mission, what they were actually doing on the ground was destroying the lived reality of millions of people.
The physical and cultural destruction was profound. The imperialists didn't just set up trading posts and buy resources. They systematically dismantled local ways of life.
They aggressively deposed existing tribal leaderships, shattered ancient monarchical systems, and replaced them with colonial administrators.
They did introduce Western education and infrastructure, right?
Right.
Like railroads and telegraphs.
Yes, but it was never designed for the benefit of the local populace. They built railroads strictly from the inland mines directly to the coastal ports to extract wealth. They provided just enough Western education to train a tiny sliver of the local population to act as low-level, middle management bureaucrats to help run the empire.
But the most devastating disruption, the one that really sets the stage for the massive revolutions later, was what they did to the agricultural economies. How does an imperial power actually fundamentally change how a colonized person gets their food?
By completely dismantling subsistence farming. Prior to colonial arrival, the vast majority of these societies were built on subsistence agriculture communities, growing a diverse range of crops primarily to feed themselves and their local regions. It was a resilient system.
But the imperial powers looked at that and saw zero profit for the home country.
So they forcefully reshaped the economies. They implemented massive land seizures, displaced millions of peasants, and transformed self-sustaining agricultural land into massive commercial plantations.
And these plantations aren't growing food for the locals to eat. They are forced to grow export-driven cash crops.
Exactly. Indigo, cotton, rubber, tea, coffee. Or they forced the local populations into brutal, highly dangerous mining operations to extract gold, diamonds, and copper.
So you take a population that for centuries could feed itself, even if they weren't rich. You take their land, you force them to grow rubber for European tires, and suddenly they have to buy their food on the global market using the microscopic wages the colonizers pay them.
You have completely removed their ability to sustain their own lives.
You structurally primed entire continents for disaster.
They absolutely did. By destroying local subsistence farming and replacing it with a fragile, export-driven economy controlled entirely by foreign cartels, the imperialists forced massive populations onto the razor's edge of starvation.
Because if prices drop, they're doomed.
If the global price of rubber drops, a farmer in Africa or Asia suddenly cannot afford to buy imported food and mass famine ensues. If we connect this to the bigger picture, by destroying the social, political, and economic foundations of these traditional societies, the European powers were unwittingly laying down the absolute perfect powder keg.
They were creating the very conditions that would explode into the violent anti-colonial rebellions of the 20th century. But here's a critical pivot in our diagnostic journey today. The outrage against industrial capitalism and this whole modern system wasn't just happening overseas in the colonized world. The pressure cooker was building right inside the belly of the beast.
Inside the wealthiest cities of the West London, Paris, Berlin, New York.
The living conditions for the urban working class were sparking massive, profound ideological resistance.
Because the wealth being generated by the factories and the empires was not trickling down to the people actually operating the machines. We have to understand how truly abominable the factory conditions of the 19th and early 20th centuries were.
Let's talk about the specific mechanics of that misery. It's not just that the work was hard, it was all-consuming.
We are talking about standard shifts of 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The factories were deafening, poorly ventilated, and incredibly dangerous. Lung diseases from cotton dust or coal smoke were endemic.
And the accidents.
Industrial accidents involving massive unguarded gears and belts were a daily reality, and if you lost an arm, you were simply fired with no compensation.
And child labor wasn't just common. It was an essential, normalized pillar of the industrial economy.
Because children could be paid a fraction of an adult's wage and could crawl under jamming machinery, wages were meticulously calculated by factory owners to remain at absolute subsistence levels, just barely enough calories, and rent money to keep a worker alive to return to the factory the next day.
And compounding all of this daily physical misery is the psychological terror we talked about earlier, the business cycle. Modern capitalism is prone to massive boom and bust cycles.
And in this era, there was no Federal Reserve, no unemployment insurance, no welfare state. If a financial panic hit London or New York, credit would freeze, and factories would simply chain their doors shut overnight, resulting in sudden, catastrophic mass layoffs.
You could be working a 14-hour shift on Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, you and your family were entirely destitute, facing eviction and starvation. The precarity was absolute.
Out of this intense, crushing misery, you start seeing brilliant intellectuals, labor organizers, and the workers themselves desperately trying to design an escape hatch.
The status quo was unbearable, so they began formulating alternative visions for the future. The historical record lays out three major ideological responses to early, unregulated capitalism. Let's look at the first one, which is fascinating because it's so radically different from what we ended up with in anarcho-syndicalism.
Anarcho-syndicalism is a deeply misunderstood concept today. When people hear anarchy, they think of chaos, people throwing bombs, and society burning. But as an organized political philosophy in the 19th century, it was highly structured.
How so?
The anarcho-syndicalists looked at the suffering of the working class and asked, why are the factory owners able to get away with this? They identified the centralized state, the national government, as the primary enforcer of inequality.
They realized that the state wasn't a neutral referee. I mean, look at the poor laws we talked about earlier. The state literally outlawed unemployment. And when workers did try to organize a strike to demand better conditions, who showed up?
Not the factory owner.
The government deployed armed troops and state police to physically shoot at the striking workers. The state was just the taxpayer-funded muscle for the capitalists.
Exactly. The anarcho-syndicalist conclusion was that as long as a centralized state exists, it will inevitably be captured by the wealthy and used to oppress the poor. Therefore, their goal was to completely dismantle the national government. No parliaments, no kings, no standing armies.
But wait, if you dismantle the government, how do you fix the roads? How do you organize society? We need to define the syndicalism part of the name.
Syndicate essentially translates to a trade union or a worker cooperative. They weren't advocating for a Mad Max wasteland. Their vision for the future was a vast, decentralized network of self-managing worker cooperatives.
The people who actually work the factory own the factory collectively.
The people who farm the land own the land collectively. These syndicates would coordinate with each other voluntarily for trade and infrastructure. It was deeply rooted in a romanticized vision of the past.
They looked back longingly at the era of the independent artisan who owned his own tools.
Or the peasant who worked cooperatively in a village commune. They wanted to recreate that deep local autonomy, but apply it to the modern industrial landscape. No overarching government telling them what to do.
Okay, so that's alternative one, destroy the state. Then you have the second alternative, which looks at the same misery, but takes the exact opposite approach to the government. We're talking about socialism.
Socialists looked at the immense, towering wealth being generated by the new capitalist factories and railroads, and they said, we don't want to destroy the system, and we certainly don't want to dismantle the state. The state is incredibly powerful. We just need to capture it and fundamentally repurpose it.
It's the Robin Hood approach, but institutionalized.
Exactly. Socialists believed the state should serve as the great equalizer. Instead of acting as the private security force for the industrialists, the government should enact massive progressive taxation. They wanted to siphon off the extreme profits of the wealthy capitalists and redistribute that wealth to cure the inequities of the system.
They advocated for state-funded social welfare programs, public housing, universal education, and free healthcare.
And crucially, they believed the state should actively protect labor unions, giving workers legal backing to negotiate collectively against the owners. They wanted to tame capitalism, not abolish it, using the power of a strong government.
Which brings us to the third alternative, and here's where it gets really interesting. We're talking about communism, and specifically the deeply influential theories of Karl Marx.
Right.
In popular culture today, Marx is almost entirely reduced to a caricature. He's viewed purely as this scowling anti-capitalist crusader who hated everything about modern industry, wealth, and progress. But when you actually sit down and read his critique of capitalism, it is profoundly nuanced and frankly surprising.
Very surprising to most people.
He wasn't just angry about the wealth gap between the rich and the poor. He was diagnosing a spiritual sickness. He was obsessed with a concept called alienation.
And this is the absolute core of Marxist philosophy. Yes, he recognized the brutal physical exploitation and the poverty, but his fundamental philosophical critique was about what the capitalist mode of production does to the human soul.
Okay, lay that out for us.
Marx started with a basic premise: what makes us human? He believed that human beings are fundamentally defined by our capacity for conscious, creative production. We achieve our humanity, we find our purpose through the act of creating things and seeing ourselves reflected in our work.
Okay, I want to make sure I understand this deeply. So, before capitalism, if you were a cobbler making shoes, you procured the leather, you designed the shoe, you cut it, you sewed it, you sold it to a neighbor, and you saw that neighbor walking around in your creation.
You own the entire process.
Your creativity was embedded in the shoe.
Precisely. You possessed ownership of your labor and its product. But capitalism, and specifically the extreme specialization of the factory assembly line, completely strips that away. In a modern factory, you aren't making a shoe.
You are a guy whose only job is to punch 3 holes in a piece of leather, pass it down the line, and then do it again, over and over 14 hours a day.
You have no control over the design, you don't own the tools, you don't own the leather, and you don't own the shoe at the end. You don't even get to keep it. The capitalist owns all of it.
Marx argued that this system reduces a human being to a biological cog in a mechanical wheel. You are alienated from the product of your labor. You are alienated from the creative act of producing.
Because you are competing with other workers for a meager wage, you become alienated from your fellow man. And ultimately, because you are denied the ability to creatively express yourself, you are alienated from your own human nature.
The repetitive, mind-numbing labor of the factory literally dehumanizes you. It hollows out your soul.
But here is the massive plot twist in Marx's philosophy that almost everyone misses. Despite absolutely hating the experience of the factory floor, Marx was actually a massive fanboy of capitalist technology.
That is wild to think about.
He was one of the greatest modernists of his era. Marx did not want to go back to the days of artisanal cobblers. He looked at the staggering productive capacity of capitalist industry, the steam engines, the mass production, the logistical networks, and he praised it.
He saw capitalism as an incredibly dynamic, necessary, evolutionary step for human civilization.
It was solving the problem of scarcity, and crucially, he predicted that humanity was heading toward a second industrial revolution, which he was completely right about, where machines and automation would become so advanced that they would do the vast majority of the heavy lifting.
Okay, but let's follow that logic. If the machines are so advanced that they do all the heavy lifting and manufacturing, what happens to the millions of human beings whose only source of income is turning the screws on the assembly line?
And that right there is what Marx identified as the grand, fatal contradiction of capitalism. Capitalism relies entirely on exploiting human wage labor to generate profit. Marx argued that the capitalist system wouldn't be able to effectively utilize this highly automated utopian technology without rendering massive swaths of the human population entirely irrelevant and destitute. If machines do all the work, capitalism can't function because no one has wages to buy the products. You would have massive overproduction alongside massive, starving unemployment.
So his solution wasn't to smash the machines.
Not at all. His vision for communism was essentially to keep the brilliant hardware of capitalism, the incredible machines, the global factories, the advanced technology, but to completely rip out and rewrite the social software running it.
Keep the machines, lose the billionaires.
Exactly. Marx wanted the working class to seize the means of production to take over the factories. He wanted to abolish private property so that the immense, unprecedented wealth generated by these automated machines would belong to everyone equally, instantly eliminating poverty.
And crucially, because the machines would handle all the drudgery and physical labor, human beings would finally be freed from the chains of wage labor.
It's almost a post-scarcity sci-fi vision.
It truly is. In Marx's ideal communist future, human beings would finally be free to pursue varied, truly creative, unalienated lives. He famously wrote that in a communist society, a person wouldn't be forced into a single specialized job for life. You could hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, and criticize after dinner, just as you have a mind, without ever becoming a specialized hunter or fisherman.
He loved the potential of the machines, but he believed capitalism was the wrong operating system to unleash their true liberating power.
This is a profound realization. You have the wealthy capitalist on one side building empires, saying our technology and our free markets are going to lead humanity to immense wealth and a glorious future. And you have Karl Marx on the exact opposite side of the barricade saying, no, once we overthrow you and take control of this technology, then it will lead us to a communist utopia.
They bitterly, violently disagreed on who should own the future, but they completely, 100% agreed on one fundamental, foundational assumption that modern technology, science, and human rationality were driving our species forward toward a better, more perfect world.
That was the defining spirit of the age. It was an era undergirded by a deep, almost religious faith in progress and the Enlightenment ideal. The prevailing belief was that the human mind, armed with science and industry, could conquer nature and solve all of society's problems.
But then, the calendar turns. The first 3 decades of the 20th century happen. And that beautiful, comforting assumption of rational progress isn't just questioned, it is violently, traumatically shattered.
The sheer psychological impact of the early 20th century on the human psyche cannot be overstated. It is a period of unrelenting, compounding trauma that breaks the narrative of modernity, and it begins, of course, with World War I.
Let's talk about the reality of that war, because it's not just a political conflict. It is the ultimate betrayal of the industrial promise. You have these European societies that had spent a century congratulating themselves on their advanced technology, claiming it proved they were the pinnacle of human civilization.
And what did they do with it?
They turned it entirely toward industrialized slaughter. The glorious, efficient factories that were supposed to build Marx's utopia or the capitalist's golden age were instantly repurposed. Instead of consumer goods, they mass-produced heavy artillery shells, rapid-fire machine guns, armored tanks, and horrific chemical weapons like mustard gas.
The war resulted in an estimated 20 million deaths, both military and civilian. It was a meat grinder of unprecedented scale.
Men were sitting in muddy trenches, being shredded by artillery fired from miles away by machines they couldn't even see.
It proved, definitively, that technology does not possess an inherent moral compass. It doesn't inevitably make us better or more civilized. It just makes us vastly more efficient at killing each other.
It was a massive psychological blow to the concept of the rational, civilized European. And right on the heels of that unimaginable trauma, before the bodies are even buried, humanity is hit with the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic,
Which is another massive failure of the modern narrative.
The flu pandemic kills an estimated 25 million people globally, and many historians argue the true number might be twice or even 3 times that high. It swept across the globe with terrifying speed.
And what made the pandemic so psychologically devastating to the modern mind was the sheer pathetic impotence of modern science. Here you have these incredibly arrogant societies. They can engineer weapons capable of leveling cities. They have laid telegraph cables across the bottoms of oceans to connect continents in real time.
But when faced with a microscopic, invisible virus, they were completely, utterly powerless. Science, the great god of the 19th century that was supposed to conquer the natural world, could do essentially nothing to stop the dying. The most advanced hospitals in the world could offer nothing better than telling people to wear cloth masks and lock themselves in their homes.
Okay, so you somehow survive the mechanized slaughter of the trenches. You survive a global plague that science couldn't cure. And then a decade later, the foundational economic engine of the world completely bottoms out. The Great Depression hits.
It wasn't just a severe recession. The global economic system seized up. World commerce dropped by a staggering 60%. Industrial production worldwide plummeted by over 30%. Millions upon millions of people were thrown into sudden, agonizing unemployment and poverty.
And this shakes the core faith in the free market to its absolute foundations. Because it didn't look like a temporary dip. It felt terminal.
That is crucial to understand. In the 1930s, many people, including incredibly prominent economists and intellectuals in the West, genuinely believed that capitalism was permanently dead. The free market had failed so spectacularly that they believed a massive state-managed system, perhaps fascism, perhaps communism, was the only viable path forward to prevent mass starvation. The economic engine that was supposed to guarantee endless prosperity had catastrophically stalled.
So the political systems are failing, the economy is failing, science is failing. But it goes even deeper than that. The very way humanity understood itself, the way we understood reality and the universe, was fracturing. There is this massive intellectual and cultural crisis happening simultaneously. Let's look at psychology first. We have the rise of Sigmund Freud.
Now, I know a lot of Freud's specific theories about dreams and childhood development have been heavily critiqued or debunked since then, but his core argument introduced a terrifying, disruptive idea to the modern world.
Freud took a sledgehammer to the Enlightenment. For 2 centuries, the prevailing philosophy was that human beings are fundamentally rational, logical creatures. We gather data, we make logical choices.
Freud suggested that this is a complete illusion. He argued that the vast majority of human behavior is driven by deep, irrational, unconscious urges, desires, and traumas that we don't even understand or control.
Which is a terrifying concept if your entire civilization is built on the premise of rationality. If the people designing your political systems, the economists building your markets, and the generals controlling your machine guns are actually driven by subconscious, irrational impulses, it calls the entire project of modernity into question. We aren't rational actors building a utopia. We are apes with powerful tools driven by hidden neuroses.
Exactly. And this profound sense of an unknowable, shifting reality was bleeding directly into the hard sciences as well. You have brilliant figures like Max Planck and Albert Einstein introducing quantum physics and the theory of relativity.
E equals mc squared.
Right. Before Einstein, the world operated on a very comforting, intuitive Newtonian model. The universe was viewed essentially like a giant, predictable clockwork machine. Objects were solid, time ticked away at a constant universal rate, gravity pulled things down. It made sense.
But relativity and quantum mechanics completely broke that intuition. They proved mathematically that at a fundamental level, the solid, dependable world was actually an incomprehensible shifting mass of energy. Matter could transform into energy. Space could bend. Time was relative depending on how fast you were moving.
The universe was no longer neat, orderly, and entirely knowable. It was deeply strange, paradoxical, and largely beyond the comprehension of the average person. You couldn't trust your own senses anymore to understand reality.
And you see this profound disorientation immediately reflected in the culture. The sources point to modern art, specifically Pablo Picasso. Look at Cubism. Picasso isn't painting nice, realistic, orderly portraits of reality. His art is violently fractured, distorted, showing multiple contradictory perspectives simultaneously. It is a brilliant visual representation of a reality that has lost its objective, stable center. Everything is fragmented. Yeah.
What's fascinating here is how all these elements, the horrific carnage of the war, the helplessness of the flu, the economic collapse, the bizarre new science, the fractured art, they all culminate in a profound collective existential crisis. It violently punctured the hubris of the age, and perhaps nothing symbolized that hubris and its spectacular failure more perfectly than the sinking of the Titanic.
Oh, the Titanic is the ultimate, almost too perfect metaphor for this entire era. It was literally built as a floating palace of elite, modern technological supremacy, the pinnacle of engineering. They claimed man had built a machine that was practically unsinkable, and is brought down almost casually on its maiden voyage by a piece of frozen water, nature effortlessly brushing aside the arrogant machine.
You start seeing a massive shift in pop culture reflecting this trauma. In the 19th century, in literature and early film, the scientist is the hero. He's the pioneer of progress, bringing light to the darkness. But in the 20th century, following the war, you start getting movies like Frankenstein.
The narrative completely flips. The scientist becomes a hubristic madman who arrogantly meddles with the forces of nature, and his technological creations inevitably turn back to destroy him. It's a complete cultural loss of faith in the narrative of progress.
So humanity is left standing in the smoking rubble of the early 20th century, looking at the millions of dead and asking a very dark, fundamental question. If we are actually irrational creatures and our glorious technology just brings faster destruction, unstoppable pandemics, and profound economic ruin, what are we actually doing? Are we rushing toward a bright utopia, or are we just highly efficient engineers building our own extinction?
It's a moment of profound European self-doubt. But right as Europe is deeply traumatized, questioning the very concept of modernity, a new superpower steps up to the global plate. And this superpower has absolutely zero existential doubts. It is brimming with an unshakable, almost aggressive confidence. We're talking, of course, about the United States.
The rise of the United States in the late 19th and 20th centuries fundamentally redefines what modernity looks like on a global scale. America wasn't burdened by the feudal history or the immediate physical devastation of World War I that Europe was. And to understand American modernity, you have to understand its foundational mythology, the deeply ingrained idea of being a city upon a hill.
This traces all the way back to the early Puritans in Massachusetts, right?
It does. Early English settlers viewed their society in the New World as a literal New Jerusalem, a pure, idealized Christian community that would serve as a shining moral beacon for a corrupt old Europe. But as the centuries progressed, particularly around the American Revolution and the founding of the Republic, that strictly religious mission secularized. It transformed into a profound nationalistic belief that the United States possessed unique, superior political, social, and economic institutions.
It's the concept of American exceptionalism.
Yes, but embedded in that exceptionalism was an aggressive mandate. It wasn't enough for America to just be superior and sit quietly across the ocean. America felt it had a historical, almost divine mission to spread its specific values and institutions to the rest of the world.
And in the 19th century, that mission initially took the form of manifest destiny. This was the absolute belief that the U.S. was divinely ordained to spread its civilization across the entire North American continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But we have to be clear here, this wasn't just a noble geographic ambition. It was deeply tied to the exact same racist, imperialist ideologies we saw justifying European conquest in Africa.
The parallels are stark. The drive westward, the displacement and genocide of indigenous populations, and specifically the aggressive war provoked with Mexico in the 1840s, were heavily justified by a belief in Anglo-Saxon racial and cultural superiority. The prevailing American narrative was that the indigenous populations in the Mexican society were intellectually, socially, and economically inferior. Therefore, the United States was totally justified in seizing their land because America was bringing the civilizing force of its superior culture, its legal systems, and its modern capitalist economy to the West. It was aggressive territorial expansion fueled by racial arrogance.
But while they're expanding their borders territorially, they're simultaneously building an absolute economic juggernaut internally. Following the American Civil War, you get this incredibly powerful, unique economic alliance forming between commercial farmers and heavy industrialists.
It created a perfect storm for rapid capitalist growth that didn't exist anywhere else. The U.S. had this massive, expanding internal population of commercial farmers. These farmers served two vital roles. They produced an endless supply of cheap raw materials for food processing industries, and simultaneously, because they were commercially successful, they formed a massive, hungry consumer market for manufactured goods like steel plows, reapers, and eventually tractors. The domestic market was vast.
And the U.S. government nurtured this system by creating an insulated economic hothouse.
They were fiercely protectionist. The U.S. government enacted incredibly heavy tariffs on foreign imports, specifically targeting European manufactured goods. This ensured that young American industries faced very little outside competition. But simultaneously, internally, across the massive continent, the government was almost entirely hands-off. There was very little regulation, no internal tariffs between states, allowing the free market to operate with massive, unconstrained energy and brutality.
And this protected hothouse environment allows the U.S. to absolutely master the Second Industrial Revolution. While Europe is bogged down in trench warfare and existential crises, the U.S. is rapidly innovating with the mass electrification of cities, massive chemical manufacturing, and the internal combustion engine. The statistics are staggering. By the 1920s, the United States was producing an astounding 42% of the entire world's industrial goods. One country producing nearly half the world's physical output.
It was an unprecedented concentration of industrial power, but there was a very dark, deeply human cost to this immense boom, and it brings us right back to Marx's fears about the factory floor. The U.S. achieved this incredible output because it pioneered radical, uncompromising new ways of organizing human labor, most notably through Taylorism and Fordism.
Let's break those down. Fordism is famous Henry Ford's invention of the continuous assembly line. You no longer have workers walking around a factory to build a car. You bolt the car to a moving belt and bring the work directly to the stationary worker at a mechanically dictated speed. It removes all human agency over pace. But Taylorism is the one that really gets under my skin. Frederick Winslow Taylor and his time motion studies.
Taylorism, or scientific management, was the ultimate horrifying expression of treating human beings literally as machines. Taylor believed that workers were inherently inefficient and lazy. So he introduced the concept of the efficiency engineer. These engineers would literally stand over a factory worker with a stopwatch and a clipboard. They would meticulously analyze every single physical movement a worker made.
So if I'm a machinist cutting a piece of metal, the engineer watches me do it. If I use 15 distinct hand motions to complete the task, the engineer calculates how to mathematically reduce it to 9 motions.
Exactly. They stripped the worker of any decision-making power. The manager dictated exactly how you moved your arm, exactly where you stood, and exactly how many seconds a specific task should take. They codified the one best way to perform every microtask and forced the worker to conform to it perfectly thousands of times a day.
The sheer indignity of that is suffocating. It strips away any lingering shred of autonomy, any craft, any pride you might have left in your work. You are completely de-skilled. You are reduced to a biological robot simply executing a manager's code. And I push back on the idea that this is just ancient history, because it reminds me vividly of the most dystopian modern workplaces today. Think about massive warehouse workers or even remote employees right now who have every single keystroke, every mouse movement, every bathroom break meticulously tracked and timed by an algorithm. You are mathematically penalized if your time off task exceeds a few allocated minutes a day. We haven't moved past Taylorism. We've just replaced the engineer's stopwatch with invisible tracking software.
You're touching on the exact mechanism. It is the exact same underlying philosophy of maximizing human extraction. And in the early 20th century, this extreme, dehumanizing efficiency provoked massive, violent labor unrest. There were huge, bloody strikes across the U.S. Workers deeply, fundamentally resented being reduced to cogs. It perfectly echoed Karl Marx's warnings about alienation. The technological output was undeniably incredible, but it was creating an intensely volatile, miserable, and alienated working class. We mentioned Charlie Chaplin's film Modern Times in passing earlier, but it truly brilliantly captured this specific anxiety. There's that iconic scene where his character is performing a repetitive wrenching motion so fast and for so long that he literally gets pulled physically into the massive gears of the factory machine. It was comedy, but it was a visceral reflection of how workers felt completely consumed by the industrial process.
So the U.S. has built this incredibly powerful industrial machine. But by the late 19th and early 20th century, it runs into two massive existential problems. First, the workers hate the system and are threatening to strike, unionize, or revolt. And second, the industrial machine has become too efficient. It is producing far more stuff than the American public can physically buy or consume.
This was the crisis of overproduction. The sheer physical capacity of American industry was flooding the domestic market. If you make 10 million shoes, but your population only needs 5 million, prices collapse, factories close, and you enter a severe economic depression. The system was literally threatening to choke on its own staggering success. To solve this dual crisis, economic overproduction and domestic worker unrest, America invented two massive society-altering workarounds.
Okay, let's look at workaround number one, which is directed outward the economic empire. Unlike the European powers, the U.S. looked at traditional territorial colonialism, physically conquering, occupying, and administering foreign countries in Africa or Asia, and decided it was vastly too expensive, militarily risky, and politically difficult.
The European model of carving up a continent and managing local rebellions was unappealing to American strategists. Instead, influential figures like Secretary of State William Seward, famous for purchasing Alaska, and Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan, who advocated for a powerful, globally projecting navy with strategic coaling stations, pushed for a completely different approach. Along with the cultural push of Christian missionaries expanding into places like China, they envisioned a massive economic empire.
This is the open door policy.
Exactly. The American goal wasn't to formally own the territory and govern the people. The goal was to pry open global markets, using diplomatic coercion or the threat of naval force if necessary, to ensure those markets were completely open to absorb the massive, suffocating surplus of American industrial goods. They wanted access, leverage, and economic dominance without the messy administrative burden of a traditional political empire.
It's imperial power without imperial responsibility. Right. And then we get to workaround number two, which is directed entirely internally to pacify those restless, angry assembly line workers. And this is a massive shift in human history. America invents modern consumerism. Now, to be clear, people have always bought and sold things in marketplaces for thousands of years, but the historical texts are clear that consumerism with a capital C is a uniquely modern philosophy, engineered largely by the burgeoning advertising industry of the 1920s.
It represents a profound psychological and philosophical shift in how humans find meaning. Consumerism is the deliberately socially engineered belief that the ultimate happiness, fulfillment, and status of a human being lies fundamentally in the consumption of material goods and services. Early advertising pioneers, heavily influenced by psychology, some even drawing on Freud's ideas of subconscious desires, realized they had to change how they sold products. Advertising stopped just logically telling you what a product physically did, and it started selling you an emotional state.
Right. If you look at an ad from the 1890s, it says, "This soap cleans dirt well." But an ad in the 1920s or today doesn't sell the utility. It says, "If you buy this specific brand of soap, your neighbors won't gossip about your dirty clothes, you will be respected, and your family will be happy." They equated the act of purchasing a mass-produced item with achieving psychological well-being and social belonging.
And this consumer ethos began to aggressively commercialize every single aspect of human life. Think about the transition in the 19th century. A working class family made their own soap, they sewed their own clothes, they baked their own bread. In the 20th century, you bought all of those things. But it went far beyond physical necessities. Human interactions, community support, and emotional well-being were rapidly commercialized.
Explain how that happens. How do you commercialize an emotion?
Well, historically, if you were feeling depressed or lost, you might seek counsel from an elder in your extended family, a community leader, or a local religious figure. It was a communal support structure. In the modern consumer society, that communal tie is severed, and you instead pay a licensed therapist $150 an hour. If you want to improve your personality or your social skills, you don't turn to community mentorship. You buy a self-help book or pay for a seminar. We transitioned rapidly into a society where almost every human need, whether it's physical sustenance or deep emotional validation, is expected to be met through a commercial transaction.
So what does this all mean for our deeply alienated factory worker standing there hating the stopwatch? Basically, consumerism served as an ingenious, incredibly effective societal bribe. The capitalist system essentially looked at the worker and said, "Look, we're not going to change the reality of the factory. Your job is still going to be mind-numbingly repetitive. You will still have no creative control, and the manager is still going to time your bathroom breaks. But if you keep your head down and endure the shift, we will grant you access to an unprecedented material lifestyle. We will give you a mortgage for a nice house in the suburbs, you can finance a car, you can buy a shiny new refrigerator, and you can get a television to entertain you at the end of the day." They used access to consumer goods as the ultimate pacifier. "We won't fix the soul-crushing reality of your labor, but we'll give you enough shiny things at home so you don't burn the factory down."
That is exactly the dynamic that stabilized American capitalism, and it highlights precisely where Karl Marx profoundly miscalculated his predictions. Marx assumed that capitalism's inherent contradictions would inevitably drive the working class into deeper and deeper unendurable poverty until they literally had nothing left to lose but their chains, sparking the Great Revolution. He simply did not foresee that the capitalist machine could become so efficient that it could produce immense, overwhelming material wealth and distribute just enough of it downward to essentially buy off the revolution in its home countries. Consumerism created a massive middle class that was heavily invested in maintaining the status quo because of their access to consumer goods and debt.
Okay, so the U.S. has successfully solved its internal political problems with the bribe of consumerism, and it's successfully projecting its economic power outward to absorb its surplus goods. But the U.S. didn't just want to sell Coca-Cola and Ford cars abroad. It fundamentally believed in its city upon a hill mandate. It wanted to export its entire cultural operating system. It genuinely believed its specific way of life was the objective peak of human progress. And when this incredibly specific, highly engineered American value system collided with the deep, ancient traditions of the rest of the world, it lit the fuse for the global 20th century revolutions.
To understand the ferocity of the global backlash, we have to look very clearly at the specific core values the United States was aggressively pushing onto the global stage. These are traits that feel entirely normal, almost invisible to someone raised in the modern West, but they represent a radical, offensive departure from how most human societies have organized themselves throughout recorded history.
The history points to 5 specific core American values that were pushed globally. Let's discuss them. The first is obvious, given what we just talked about, materialism.
Yes, but in the American model, materialism isn't just an appreciation for nice things. It operates as the primary objective metric for measuring human success. The intrinsic value of an individual, the worth of a corporation, or the success of an entire nation is measured almost exclusively by its capacity for physical accumulation and wealth generation. GDP becomes the sole measure of a country's health. The guiding philosophy is eternally more and bigger is better.
And if you define a society entirely by material wealth, the logical next step, the second value is competitiveness. Because wealth is largely a zero-sum game, it inherently breeds a culture where you have to fight for it.
Absolutely. American culture places an overwhelming premium on intense competition, operating under the belief that it is the best, most natural mechanism for bringing out excellence and driving technological progress. Whether you are looking at the grading curves in schools, the structure of sports, or the cutthroat nature of the free market, the focus is entirely on the individual or the corporation that can aggressively outdo the opposition. Victory over your peers is celebrated far above cooperative success or mutual survival.
Which flows perfectly into the third value, individualism.
This is perhaps the most defining and disruptive American trait when exported abroad. The American system elevates the rights, desires, ambitions, and self-expression of the individual far above the needs, traditions, or cohesion of the family or the broader community. The ultimate goal of life is personal self-actualization. But we must understand that for many traditional community-based societies across the globe, this extreme focus on the self is viewed not as liberation or freedom, but as acute selfishness, moral decay, and the destruction of the social fabric.
The fourth value is the cult of progress, or the worship of the new.
This is the default cultural assumption that human society is on a linear path forward, and therefore whatever is new is inherently and objectively superior to whatever is old. It creates a culture that casually discards traditional practices in favor of novelty. A mundane but revealing example is dismissing the ancient communal tradition of a long, home-cooked family dinner and replacing it with the novelty of eating highly processed fast food in your car simply because the fast food is modern and efficient. It generates a society with very little reverence for history, ancestral precedent, or elder wisdom.
And finally, the fifth value, secularism.
The American model relies heavily on a strict structural separation of the spiritual and the public spheres. Religion, faith, and profound moral beliefs are relegated entirely to the private sphere. It's something you do quietly on your own time on a Sunday. The public square, the government framework, and most importantly, the massive economic engine are meant to be strictly secular, operating purely on logic, profit, and the here and now.
Now, how did America actually force these highly specific cultural values onto the rest of the globe? Because it wasn't just soft power. It wasn't just Hollywood movies and jazz music organically winning people over. Following FDR's New Deal and the end of World War II, there was a highly concerted, institutionalized effort by an alliance of the U.S. government, massive high-tech industries, and even major labor unions to actively shape a global environment friendly to American economic interests.
They systematically built a massive, coercive global export mechanism. We are talking about the establishment of incredibly powerful international institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. Through organizations like the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, massive amounts of foreign aid were dispersed, but always with heavy strings attached.
Let's explain how those strings actually work, because that's the mechanism of control. It's called a structural adjustment loan.
Yes. The World Bank might approach a developing nation and say, we will give you $1 billion loan to build a hydroelectric dam and modernize your infrastructure. But the condition of that loan is that the recipient nation must fundamentally restructure its internal economy to align with U.S. free market principles. They must privatize their state-owned water supply. They must cut government subsidies that help poor subsistence farmers buy seed. And they must open their borders to American corporate investment.
So you're using debt to legally force a foreign country to adopt capitalism. And private entities were involved too, right? Major philanthropic organizations like the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations aggressively shaped global education curriculums and agricultural policies to mirror American systems. And when economic coercion and educational influence weren't enough, the CIA engaged in direct, covert operations to physically topple democratically elected governments that resisted this integration into the American economic sphere. The goal was to relentlessly force other nations to adopt compatible economic and cultural systems, whether they wanted them or not.
This raises an important question. Are these modern American values actually universally applicable to all of humanity? Or are they a hyper-specific, historically contingent cultural export that inherently disrespects, destabilizes, and destroys traditional societies?
I really want you, the listener, to put yourself in those shoes for a moment. Imagine living in a deeply traditional society in the mid-20th century. Imagine an immensely powerful, wealthy outside force essentially taking over your country's economy through debt. They systematically demand the dismantling of everything your grandparents valued, your local community support structures, the presence of your religion in public life, your traditional ways of farming and working. And then, through their media and their institutions, they look at you and tell you that you are backwards, underdeveloped, and uncivilized, unless you abandon all of your heritage and focus entirely on individual competition, personal wealth accumulation, and buying Western consumer products. For millions of people around the world, the American version of modernity didn't feel like a bright, progressive future. It felt like an incredibly aggressive alien virus designed to destroy their cultural DNA. And that profound realization that modernity meant the death of their identity sparked massive, varied forms of violent backlash.
We see this backlash manifest globally in several profound, world-shaking ways. In the colonial world, you had brilliant leaders emerge who had been educated in Western universities, who deeply understood the Western operating system, and who skillfully turned the West's own philosophies against it. Mahatma Gandhi in India is the prime example. He took deeply Western Enlightenment concepts of liberal government, self-determination, and the rights of the citizen, and weaponized them to publicly expose the grotesque hypocrisy of British imperialism. If the West truly believes in freedom and democracy, how can it logically justify militarily subjugating the entire Indian subcontinent?
You also see the massive, explosive rise of post-colonial nationalism.
Exactly. Diverse populations across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East that had previously identified themselves primarily by their local tribe, their specific village, or their religious sect began to forge broad, modern national identities. They did this specifically as a necessary defense mechanism to unite enough people to throw off the external colonizers. The concept of the nation became the shield against Western imperialism. Furthermore, you had the Soviet communist model actively offering these newly independent nations an alternative path to rapid state-managed industrialization that seemingly bypassed the pitfalls of Western capitalist domination and exploitation.
And crucially, rounding out the century, you had the dramatic rise of modern political Islam. We see this culminating spectacularly in events like the 1979 Iranian Revolution. This was a society that had experienced forced westernization and secularization under the US-backed Shah, and they used the deep, unbreakable communal bonds of religious identity to utterly and violently reject Western secularism, individualism, and consumerism. The Iranian Revolution was a society looking directly at the American blueprint for modernity and essentially saying, no, we reject your premise. Our spiritual integrity and our communal religious values are vastly more important than your material wealth and your individualistic freedom.
It was a complete rejection of the Western narrative.
So bringing this massive historical journey together, we have traced a line from the brutal forced land enclosures of feudal England through the soot-choked skies and 14-hour shifts of the Industrial Revolution to the soul-crushing stopwatch time efficiency of the Detroit assembly lines, all the way to the aggressive, debt-fueled global push of American consumerism. And it was all, every step of it, done in the name of progress. But the relentless pursuit of that highly specific, deeply material version of progress displaced millions of peasants, alienated generations of workers from their own humanity, shattered ancient traditional cultures, and ultimately loaded the powder keg for the explosive anti-colonial and anti-capitalist revolutions that completely defined the geopolitical landscape of the 20th century.
The philosopher and cultural critic Walter Benjamin summarized this entire violent epoch with a striking, truly terrifying analogy. He said that if the relentless, unyielding push of modernity is a great, unstoppable train rushing blindly forward into an unknown future, perhaps the violent 20th century revolutions weren't trying to hijack the train. Perhaps the revolutions were simply the terrified passengers in the back cars, desperately reaching for the emergency brake.
That is such a haunting, powerful image. Modernity as a runaway train. And it leaves me with one final provocative thought for you to mull over as we end today. We spent a lot of time today talking about Taylorism. We talked about those early 20th century efficiency engineers standing over miserable factory workers with literal stopwatches, dictating every single micro movement of their arms to make them act like perfect, predictable, highly efficient machines. We look back at that history and we rightfully think it's barbaric and dehumanizing. But I want you to look at us today. Look down at your own wrist. We willingly, eagerly strap smartwatches to our own bodies to meticulously track our daily step counts, to perfectly optimize our sleep cycles, to measure our heart rates, and to monitor our daily screen time. We happily download productivity apps to track our focus in 15-minute increments. Have we internalized the demands of the capitalist machine so deeply, so completely, that we no longer even need the factory boss to time us? Have we voluntarily become our own efficiency engineers, constantly surveilling and optimizing ourselves for a system that implicitly tells us we are only as valuable as our maximum daily output?
It's a deeply uncomfortable, haunting modern reality.
It really is.
Yeah.
It turns out that mission we set out on at the beginning of the show, trying to cleanly diagnose modernity in the 20th century, is incredibly difficult because we are still deeply entangled in the symptoms. The historical waters are muddy, but the waters of our own modern lives might be even murkier. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.